Hi, welcome to my table. It's reflective of some of the things that I certainly think are good and promote goodness. There's a very large pastry to my right. There's some fruits to my left, a couple bottles of wine, and then books. We might as well turn this into a summer reading list while we're at it, because there's nothing that promotes goodness quite like engaging yourself and being captivated by a good book, fiction or nonfiction. There are a couple of connotations, I guess, of goodness that I'd like to get on the table first, that go back to my childhood. Uh, First one, having grown up in the church, is the psalmist. That notion that surely goodness and mercy, or goodness and justice, depending on the translation, will follow me all the days of my life. And as a kid, I remember thinking that was intriguing, poetic, promising, also a little bit ominous, because it seemed so entirely external to me. And it turns out that it was God that was wielding all this power and deciding, who might get a little mercy and goodness and compassion, and not so much me, that I was a very small part in any notion of goodness. And then just as a kid, having anybody, especially somebody omnipotent, following you around is a little daunting. You know? So that on one side. On the other side, I grew up in an era, born in 1958, 60s, early 70s, where the food companies never met a chemical additive, a preservative that they didn't like. And so we ate things from the bounty of the earth that were nonetheless chock full of these chemicals, additives, and preservatives. Probably one of the reasons why those of us in our 50s and 60s, early 70s look as good as we do. But everything was chock full of goodness. I mean, that was the advertisement, that was the message. That even smoking, right? I'd come home from elementary school as a kid, my mother would be wreathed in a menthol haze, and that somehow even was reflective of goodness in some way. Followed by a vodka stinger and, let's have another kid, and somehow this was all going to work out. This was all good. It's all post-work goodness. We're on top of the world. God is, in the corner of the United States. And I was raised with a lot of those kinds of notions that nothing much could or should go wrong, at least until they told us to get under our desks, in the case of an atomic explosion, in which case that seemed less good to me than some of the other possibilities I was living on a regular basis. Goodness, on one hand, comes down to, on this Augustinian notion of properly ordering one's desires, learning to love the right things. And even though he's a Neoplatonist, takes most of his ideas and inspiration from Plato and Christianizes it, nonetheless, there's some Aristotelian notions that follow along that path as well. You look for that golden mean between excesses. How do you know what's good? I mean, every time I have this kind of conversation in ethics class, the easiest rejoinder is always, well, who's to say? Who's to know? How could you possibly know? What's good? Isn't that just a matter of everybody's taste? Isn't that just a matter of how everybody was brought up, et cetera, et cetera? Which is an easy, relatively facile objection, and not one, I think, that stands up particularly well under a fair bit of scrutiny. Of course, there are some deep relativities in the world. There are conservative liberal splits, there are generational splits, there's cultural evolution and the kinds of splits that you find in that. But underneath that, and baseline, and this is where the sciences are helping us out in ethical territory as well as in non-ethical or non-moral territory, we're learning more and more about some of those underlying bases and foundations for what does in fact make life better or more attuned to goodness than not. All right? One of the things, coming both from philosophy and science, I think, and literature, perhaps more than any of the others, literature as well, is that we know, let's go back to science for a second, we know that if I choose to nurture myself, nourish myself between these two choices, it's ginormous pastry and organic apples, grapes, apricots, and they are organic because we drank the Kool-Aid at my house, like many places. And I know I'm going to feel better, not just in the short term, but probably in the long term as well, if I consistently choose these. My reason, informed by science, informed by experience, informed by the examples around me, assuming that they're good, thoughtful, mindful examples, people really do want to both nourish themselves and avail themselves of the goodness of these particular fruits of the earth, as well as be good stewards of the bounty of the earth, that external benefactor that helps me achieve my own aims, hopefully good ones. And then on the other hand, my desires, my impulses, my unchecked emotions, right? Which the history of philosophy has said, must be ruled and overruled by my head. It's the history of dualism. So I should always choose what's on my left here and never indulge myself with what's on my right. That's a lesson not only from religion, but philosophy as well. But what if I can't really fully appreciate or know what goodness is if all I've ever done is follow the rules? Now I'm talking to an audience which understands that breaking some taboos, transgressing some norms, is what wins you something like a deeper knowledge and a deeper appreciation of what goodness might actually be, until you see or steep yourself in even some of the excesses that life has to offer. One gives over oneself to some of the desires, impulses, temptations, and realizes that maybe all of those aren't, not all of them anyway, are as harmful as what one has been told out of the kind of dread of parenthood, the church, or other social conventions and institutions that purport to be looking out for us. That, taking a big bite from the pastry, as it were, or the metaphorical tree of knowledge apple, might lead me to a kind of appreciation of what's good and what's good for me and others, that suggests that the occasional walk on the wild side isn't always going to lead, isn't always the straightest or surest path to hell. It's in fact a path to a kind of knowledge that can't be won in any other way. Obviously, you want to check that. There are some limits. We are the parents of kids coming into their teenage years. We're not just going to drop them off in Amsterdam with a blank check and say, hey, come back once you find out what the world's really like and explore every last, impulse you might have. I hope, need to go to Vietnam. I missed being drafted just by a couple of years to understand through movies, television, documentaries, first-person testimonial, terrific books like this one, The Committed, that fuel my imagination, that help me understand the goodness of peace, that help me understand the goodness of mediation, of ethics as an alternative to war or to violence. So I'm saying a couple of different things here, that while we've got philosophy, religion, and perhaps even more credibly these days science, to help us understand what's best for us, or where the desire and what the consequences of pursuing the best path will be. Fortunately, we've got literature as well, and the rest of the arts, to help us to understand that in psychology, to help us understand that there might be circumstances under which, while the fruits and vegetables are more nourishing, the pastry might be a little bit more nurturing. And we ought not to beat ourselves up too badly about that particular aspect of our humanity, whether you're Augustinian, Aristotelian, or something else altogether. There are certain virtues, I think, a constellation of virtues that probably make up what we recognize as goodness in somebody. And again, that kind of earned goodness, not somebody who has conformed to somebody else's notion, historical or modern, of what goodness is. I think that certainly kindness, humility, responsibility, gentleness, wit, humor, all go into at least what my notion of goodness would be. Whether you're following God or following nature, whether you think one or the other is more responsible for that, or whether you think it's socially constructed, which I don't. My response is to the people who say, well, you probably have some definition of generosity or gentleness or humility that's different than mine, but it's two-pronged response to that given the limits of time. And one would be, the students wouldn't come to class, you wouldn't tune in if you thought all the words that I was going to use today, all the words that I'm using, were all somehow subject to debate and all somehow outside the realm of anything like a shared meaning or shared context. It just wouldn't make any sense. It's one of the good things about us as humans is that we come into the world, as Chomsky explained, ready to, or fully equipped to learn a language with what he called an underdetermination of data, which describes an awful lot of life, right? Not everything has to be programmed into me, and yet there's an awful lot through inference that I nonetheless can come to know and appreciate. And a word like gentleness, for me, probably is at the heart of understanding what goodness is. You can make your case for a lot of different words. My guess is we would get more consensus than not about it. But I'll bring in one of my favorite French philosophers, contemporary, André Comte-Sponville, who writes about gentleness this way, and see if you don't agree that there's something about what he's saying that A, we have a shared experience of, B, we could probably all more or less agree in reflecting on that experience, and C, we might also agree would be, yes, a reasonable and appreciable component of anything like goodness, if that's what we want. He says, it's courage without violence, it's strength without harshness, and it's love without anger. I would just add, because I can't help it, some of maybe a Buddhist addendum to that, and that is the ability to be present with others without bringing your own dread and anxiety into the picture. How are you able to be present and responsive and not act out of or react out of something the other person is saying that makes you feel dread or anxiety? So goodness is a kind of wellspring that's not just extrinsic or external, as I thought from my childhood, wholly dependent upon forces outside of myself, nature and or God. I'm not opposed to God, whatever one wants to call it, right? The transcendent, the great energy and spirit behind all of this, whatever it, he, she might be. And I think these days, one ought to have a much greater respect for the bounty and beauty of nature and the way it nurtures and nourishes not only our body, but of course our soul. We've learned an awful lot about what green spaces, what waterscapes mean to our health and well-being. And so the goodness that comes from those is also something we can return to those. The goodness is something we can learn from external sources and something that we can then apply to external sources, including other people, to promote this kind of cycle of the virtuous cycle, if you will. The gentleness, the kindness, the thoughtfulness, the mindfulness, those are one in various kinds of disciplines that you're all familiar with, meditation and therapy and proximity. And maybe start to close with an example of this kind of proximity. I remember the very first, well, let me preface it by saying this. Aristotle talks about the importance of a certain kind of luck in life, if you're going to achieve a good life. And he says there's some material wealth involved, there's some talent, and he even says good looks. So it doesn't hurt to be good looking as well. And it's interesting. Modern science has corroborated this. Robert Sapolsky in Behave talks about that phenomenon, which has been studied and corroborated a number of times, that people who are good looking by all measures, symmetry, etc., tend to get the benefit of the doubt much more than people who are not. They tend to be hired more often than not over people who are less attractive or more normal looking. They tend to make more money if they are arrested. They tend to be let off more often. In other words, Aristotle's intuition was correct. Modern science has corroborated the fact that people who are good looking are attributed a kind of moral goodness that stands them in good stead. However, before we all sort of raise up in arms about that and say, well, goodness is or the other people's sense of goodness is determined, unconsciously as a bias by how you look. Here's where proximity as a discipline in the service of goodness comes into play. And it's a story I will tell on myself, but it also has the backing of an awful lot of social and hard science corroborating studies. And that is this: the person who taught me the Hebrew Bible when I first went to graduate school, and I was on my way to, at that time, thinking I might be a Christian theologian, was one of the least attractive people I'd ever met in my life, physically. And I don't think there was any doubt about that in anybody else's mind either. Sorry, just as, it sounds like a horrible thing to say, you say, wow, that's one of the things, first things you notice, that's a remarkably unattractive person physically. All right, halfway into this class, and perhaps I more than everybody else, but certainly I and everybody else, was completely and utterly in love with this person, saw them as maybe one of the most beautiful people they'd ever met in his or her life, wanted to be close to this person, some of us probably more intimately than others, and were astounded, if we took a moment to reflect, at our own transformation. How utterly unimportant those physical looks became in the presence of somebody who embodied all of these virtues that I've referred to, who oozed goodness out of everything that he or she, I would just say they, said, did, acted, and in all the ways that they comported themselves, which is a wonderful way of saying that philosophy, religion, psychology bear attention and a kind of openness to experience and a willingness to look, again, beneath the surface, either of goodness as conformity, goodness as rules, or goodness as somehow associated with mere physical beauty, can reveal itself as something that both humbles and elevates us. And again, depending upon the circumstances, one should take a big bite of all forms of goodness as they do reveal themselves. So, have a wonderful day. Thank you.